If you're going to go for social justice in the Old Testament, crack open Amos, and he'll give it to you right over the head. And then we had the gospel reading, also very challenging. Very challenging if we take them to heart. Amos calls us to look at unjust situations that surround us and Mark directly, without beating around the bush, shows us how humanity can behave when confronted with the truth. Both show us that God wants us to look within ourselves to see how our actions help to compose and shape the lives of others. Social justice. Or if you don't relate to that combination of words, it can also be described as a moral responsibility to treat our fellow neighbor equally and without prejudice, irrespective of ethnic origin, gender, possessions, race, or religion. It's a pretty dry definition, but it's real. In June of 2012, I was in Rome, and I received a message from a friend of mine. He was gathered with his family down in Guanajuato, Mexico. And the family was all gathered down there to greet the brother who came home. And as his older brother was driving back to work with his co-worker, something happened. He never returned home. After a few days, nothing. After a few weeks, nothing. But then came a message in the form of a body found in a ditch. Francisco's co-worker, whom he drove the truck with, was found dead. The gravity of what happened set in with the family, and the idea that the violence in Mexico was greatly exaggerated by the media became a myth to this family. It was real, and it was happening to them. The family of Francisco would then go out and wonder and look on the side of the road, literally, for the body of Francisco. And then calls were made and received from an unknown source to the co-worker's family that there needed to be money in exchange for the remaining victims. But these were poor families, and in any case, the two would end up dead. This was a horrible event in their lives, and it still is. To this day, Francisco has never been found. And there are cases like this still every day in Mexico. But because they're not mass killings, we don't hear about them on the news anymore. It's real. The effects on the lives of the families are real. And this type of violence is not limited to North America. It happens all over the world. But here we are, us, in Belleville, Illinois. What has this to do with me? Everything. Because what we do here has a direct impact out there. Jesus gives us this parable to let us know that we all live in the same vineyard. Some seem to have more control over it than others, but in reality, it all belongs to us. So we should at least care what happens to all of us who live here. We should at least bring to prayer to those who suffer violence, and that's the minimum we should do. And like the God-given vineyard that those in power took control over, we too attempt to control our own little portion, and we forget everybody else. But when the prophets come in and tell us about social justice, we beat them with our tongues, and we chase them off with our loud voices. We don't listen or think it does not apply to us. Then when God sends us the beloved Son, Jesus, the one whom we cannot deny, we run the risk of rejecting him. We reinterpret his message of love to our own liking. As long as we are good enough, that is good enough. If I sin alone. Well, that's not true. I asked a group of young adults one day that I was working with if there was a problem with doing drugs besides the fact that it was not legal. I just posed that question. If it was legal, is there any problem with that? No, they said there would be no problem. The only problem is that it's illegal. Really. As long as they're not hurting anybody individually, they're okay. Really. And then we had the discussion about how drugs get into people's pockets. And we backtracked, sort of see the bigger picture. The conversation unfolded eventually, and they were able to arrive at the idea that there were people being killed in the process of drug trafficking. People they had never met. Families they would never see. Francisco's family. My friend's family, who had a wife and 2 children, and brothers and sisters, and parents, all who mourn over this, were directly affected because of drug sales on a street corner somewhere. And then we too are somewhat responsible because we allow this to happen as a society. We know the streets where this happens all over the country, and we find it difficult to think of ways where we can do something about it. We hold others responsible for it, but never ourselves sometimes. And the ultimate reason this or any injustice happens, you can name them: money and power and the desire to control the vineyard and the people who live there. That's it. The desire for wealth and possessions is what drives this. Pick any issue and you'll find it. And it is the poor who suffer the most. And Amos warns us, tells us, that we are handing over the poor for simple things like a pair of sandals or a pair of designer shoes or sneakers. We gather all the fruit into one basket and we don't want to share it. But we buy regardless of where it comes from. In our wants and desires, we run the risk of trampling upon those who are needy and poor. We need to open our eyes during this novena. Open our eyes to our actions and how they affect others. But sometimes there's a blindness on our part. We are blind not only to the things we could do for others, but blind to the things we do that affect others. We see things on the news and think, oh, that's horrible. But do I stop and think of ways that I may have contributed to that? Could I have simply loved more? Loved one person more so that in return they could love one person more? I don't know. But the challenge is there. A couple of weeks ago, I posed the question to Francisco's family to ask if there was anything they wanted to say about their son, their brother, their father. And I quote, the mother said, "The only thing we need is prayer for us and for those who suffer like us." My mother says that only prayer can stop these things to continuing to happen. Thank you. Also, my mother and my sister are very thankful for your support and your prayers. And that's all they ask for. In that horrible tragedy, they only ask for prayer. Because that prayer should lead us deeper into communion with God so we can discern our actions. Only prayer, so that we can learn to love a little more in the same way that Jesus loved us. Only prayer, because prayer is an action that directs all other actions towards God. And that prayer should change our hearts. Praying for healing and hope from social injustices is very personal to some. There are others who dedicate their lives to certain causes because it comes out of their prayer and out of their heart tonight. There are a series of items around the baptismal font that show different causes that people are supporting through the area. But tonight I'm going to fulfill the request that my friend made to us in regards to Francisco. I'm going to pray because I believe in my heart that prayer can change everything.